concept is a framework for posing questions on a more concrete level. So the development of our idea about planetary urbanization was an attempt to rethink the framework that we use to investigate urbanization processes on a planetary scale, but also in specific regional contexts. So for that reason, inevitably, there can only be specificity to urbanization processes. Planetary urbanization as a framework of investigation is not opposed at all to the priority of investigating specific patterns and pathways of urbanization. So that by way of just generalization, like there's always specificity. In terms of Latin America, there are a lot of questions that one can pose specific to Latin American urbanization processes in relationship to broader post-1980s dynamics of planetary urbanization. It's a vast theme. But one thing that I think is particularly profound in the Latin American context is the commodity boom since the early 2000s, specifically in relation to extractive industries. So in that context, the hinterlands of Latin America, so-called hinterlands, because that's already a problematic word, have undergone massive transformations in terms of infrastructure, in terms of labor markets, and in terms of their ecologies, in order to intensify extraction and also agro-industrial extraction in relation to the world market. So for me, in investigation of the Latin American context, and this is also not unique to Latin America, there are similar dynamics of extractive urbanization elsewhere, but certainly in the Latin American context, one of the specificities, among others, would be the interplay between large-scale industrial extraction in various sectors and massively accelerated urbanization. We cannot understand urbanization in Latin America just by looking at the big cities, Rio, Sao Paulo, etc. We have to connect urban restructuring in places like this to the broader industrial enclosure and infrastructuralization of hinterlands across Latin America. And for me, part of what critical urban theory in relation to planetary urbanization is trying to accomplish is precisely to make those connections. It's all about dialectical relational thinking, that the spaces of the metropolis, as complex and dynamic as they are internally, they're also forged through relationships via capitalism, infrastructure, and politics, of course, the politics of space, to many other spaces. And part of what critical urban theory is trying to do is to develop a framework through which to make those connections clear intellectually, but also politically. Like, making them clear politically is the basis on which we can act in transformative ways to produce a different kind of urbanization. Like, that's the whole point of critical urban theory for me. So a few things. So critical theory is, among other things, a project of illuminating the inequalities, the dispossessions, the exclusions, the forms of exploitation which underpin specific urbanization processes. So critical theory of all kinds, but especially critical spatial theory, critical urban theory, it's about illuminating power and inequality and dispossession. And as urban theory, it's trying to illuminate the spatialization of power relations and the materialization of power in the built environment. So that's pretty complicated. And that's also something that has to constantly change. So two other aspects of critical urban theory that I would really want to emphasize. So the critique of spatial ideology. So the world of urbanization is filled with ideologies that try to mask or naturalize very specific institutional arrangements which empower particular groups, particular classes, and exclude or disempower others. So for that reason, in all of my work, the critique of spatial ideology is essential to the task of urban theory, critical urban theory. So you have to start, in other words, with current discourses and their blind spots. And by deconstructing, by critically unpacking them, you can actually learn a lot about, the geographies of power relations in society. So that would be one other aspect. And another aspect, which is probably the most important aspect of critical urban theory, is that it's oriented, for me, towards alternative urbanizations, what I like to call in some of my work alter urbanizations, so similar to the idea of alter mondialisation, alter globalization, alter urbanization. The notion being that other urbanizations are possible. So instead of thinking about urbanization the way mainstream scholarship does, as a universal, encompassing, natural, necessary, inevitable process, we have to look at urbanization as the product and the outcome of political strategies. And as such, there can be other political strategies which produce other forms of urbanization. So when Henri Lefebvre speaks about the production of space, that already contains, as I read Lefebvre, it already contains the idea of an alter urbanization. Because if space is always produced, that means there's a politics of space. It's always contested, and it's always the result of political strategies. For me, the project of the right to the city, the project of alter urbanizations, is really the horizon. It's the fundamental horizon of critical urban theory, above and beyond all the analytical, theoretical work. What drives all the analysis and theoretical work is the search, which has to be collective. It's not just individual people, it's collective. The collective search for alter urbanizations, for other urbanizations that are possible but which are suppressed in current institutional arrangements. So all spatial representations of the urban contain underlying assumptions about the power relations and the processes that produce the urban. Sometimes they're hidden and they have to be excavated, and a lot of work can be done, a lot of productive intellectual work can be done by excavating the kind of hidden assumptions about power and society that are embedded within visualization, and whether it's photography, whether it's cartography, or any other visualization of the urban. But just as importantly, and this is really, you asked about the work we're doing in the Urban Theory Lab. In the Urban Theory Lab, we've been trying to use visualization as a tool for theory building. So not only critically deconstructing the assumptions about urbanization that are embedded within certain dominant visualizations of the urban or of urbanization processes, but using critical cartography to produce what we might think of as counter visualizations that open up new ways of thinking about urban processes and new ways of developing theory. So I believe that cartography and visualization is an important tool of critical urban theory, but it requires basically a rejection of the idea that the map is ever an accurate or complete or mimetic representation of the territory. The map is always partial, it's always mediated. So if you're reflexive about the ways in which maps are mediated through social relations and power, you can actually use cartography in productive new directions. First and foremost, it's important to have political solidarity across different contexts and conditions. As critical urban scholars around the world, we work in a variety of different political environments. And in many places around the world, including obviously right now in Brazil, there are real threats to political freedom and academic freedom. I have students in my classes from Egypt, from Iran, from China, Hong Kong. So there are questions about the freedom of academic inquiry, especially for scholars working in critical traditions. And by working together, supporting one another, and developing collaborative research networks, that is important not only for sort of intellectual solidarity, but also for protection when there are threats to scholarly freedom and freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry, which of course are rampant at the moment in the world, and there are major threats kind of looming on the horizon. Being part of a network can be very transformative. And so there's no question, like in these times more than ever, we need to consolidate networks of support and research collaboration in order to protect individual scholars who may be threatened, in order to give students horizons for thinking critically and doing creative critical work even when they may live in a political climate or in a political context in which those kinds of academic and intellectual freedoms are being threatened. There are threats, again, including in my country, in the United States, there are threats. And precisely through scholarly networking, we can have a kind of shared voice, a unified voice to protest and maybe do more than that depending on the particular context. For me, the foundational issue is just that we need alternative ways of thinking about the world in order to come up with alternative political strategies, period. And that's why theory matters. If we don't have alternatives to dominant ideologies of identitarian violence, of authoritarianism, critiques of the rule of law, then we're lost. And so critical theory in a context like that is essential because it's grounded on philosophical and political foundations that go back to centuries of political struggle for empowerment, for democratization, for equality, for ecological sanity in more recent years, etc. So this is an intellectual legacy that is deep and wide and broad, and it's global. It's connected to anti-colonial struggles. It's connected to fights against authoritarianism. It's connected to visions. It's connected to visions of more egalitarian, democratic, diverse social and political formations and their built environments. And those kinds of alternative modes of thinking are under attack and also just not being taught in a lot of universities around the world with the kind of onslaught of neoliberal and neoliberal authoritarian reaction. So for that reason, having detailed, elaborate scholarly networks which enable scholars around the world to work together to continue to develop and advance these traditions and to disseminate knowledge about them is absolutely essential. Because none of us are alone in our particular struggles. We may feel alone. We're situated in particular institutions where we have different battles that we all have to fight. We're situated in different local and regional contexts where particular battles occur. But there are broader intellectual and political solidarities that we have to maintain. So we'd have to concretize the discussion to talk about different kinds of networks and what their advantages might be. But for the project, or projects in the plural, because it's not a singular project, but for the projects of critical urban theory, we need to continue to experiment with ways to support one another across regional, national, international borders, precisely under these conditions of rather grim global politics at this moment.